Unfortunately, Heather will not be open to facilitate our conversation today. She just came back yesterday night from DC, and her flight been late. So she's trying to get back on track today. So she asked me to open and close the meeting with overview of the agenda and some next steps and review of your comments. So we have a pretty big agenda. If there's some additional ideas or thoughts on what to add to the agenda, please type it so we can change or add or edit as needed. Also, Nicole will not be able to present today on Early Achievers ECAP Standards Writing Update, but Rachel will be joining us, and Rachel will represent the Early Achievers and ECAP work. And I know that Kelly also will be available to chime in if needed. So we will start our conversation with Strive by 5, Holly Werovich, talking about the community feedback report and some of the findings in it, and then we will talk about the professional development work drafts and professional development provisions. This conversation specifically been very well respected, and also you've been asking for this particular information for quite a while, how the provisions around professional development standards will be implemented, what are the procedures behind the rules. So Angela will help us to look at the matrix, and you do have a handout of the matrix that's been introduced at the advisory committee. And I do know that not all of you have been able to participate and see the matrix. That's why we provided it today. Walk us through that and then talk specifically about the provisions. Another big question that's been brought at the advisory committee work draft reviews been about differences in age definitions at different documents. And by your request, we developed a crosswalk, and thank you, Debbie, and your team for doing it. So Debbie O'Neill will help us to walk through it today and look at those age differences and try to understand and decide how we would like to approach it and possibly what we need to do about it. Because there are pretty big differences on how we're defining age groups for different purposes. We also look today, again, by your request, a number of you have been asking, would it be a small business economic impact statement and analysis that Department of Early Learning will develop, and we will briefly talk about it today as we are tapping into this part of work as the content is more settled as it used to be. So now we can say for sure what type of impact we need to consider and what type of impact the providers may experience. And then Rachel will help us to see what are the plans of the Early Achievers and ECAP Standard Writing, and after that we will summarize and with your help develop next steps. So with this, I will ask Holly, and we will, Holly is already offline, she's unmuted, so Holly, you can start if you're ready. Holly, are you online or you're offline? Because on our, it says offline. So it seems like we cannot hear Holly. Don't know why we cannot do that. So maybe we can try to figure out the technical glitches with Holly. And do we have Angela who joined us? Yes, she is. So Angela, would you mind to start talking about professional development while I will try to figure out what happened with Holly's connection? Angela? She's muted.
She's not on the phone.
I mean, Angela is saying that she's muted.
Yeah. Oh, no, there she is.
Okay. Are you good, Angela?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we're fine. Thank you, Angela, for stepping. And Holly,
okay, looks like Holly's back on.
So
with Holly first?
So let's start with
Oh.
Angela and then we'll go to Holly, because Holly seems like she's back, but it's great. But Angela is already chiming in. So let's go to professional development.
Okay, so we're going to get started on professional development. I have a little bit of just feedback on my phone, so we'll just keep going with it. As we get to the slides, one of the things that we've been thinking about and wanting to make sure that we do a really good job about is understanding all of what's included in the draft WAC. So we know that we have the positions that are being described there. Sorry, this feedback is really difficult. I'm going to actually put this down. So we know that we have the positions described in WAC, and in many ways, because it's broken up by the various positions and the different areas, it can be difficult to follow. Luba, do we have the Excel document that we can share, or am I just going to describe it?
Yes, everyone has a handout. We don't have it on the screen, but it's been provided as a PDF.
Okay. So one of the things that we wanted to do is to be able to draw attention to everything that's included in the proposed WAC, knowing that there's so much information and it can be difficult to navigate. It's really hard when we're thinking about all of the different roles that we have within homes and centers, as well as the qualifications that are coming through CCDF requirements and trying to be fully inclusive of that. So as we're going through this, I'm going to direct you also to looking at the handout that you received. Right now we're calling it a training and education matrix by position. And so what this is doing is showing all.
Angela, can you please be closer to your microphone because we're losing you?
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So everything in the chart is inclusive of what is in the WAC, and the goal was to help describe what are the standards and qualifications for each of the roles, what are the pre-service requirements, and what are the in-service requirements. Again, remembering that the use of pre-service is all of the things that are needed before employment and everything that's happening moving forward.
Angela, we cannot hear you at all. Hello?
I'm not sure. Is that any better?
Yes, but right now it's better, but then you're disappearing.
Okay, well, hopefully it stays there. So if you have the Excel document, the goal is to then summarize what we have in the WAC based on one sheet so you can have an at-a-glance resource. So I'm going to go ahead and look on my screen at the Excel document and walk you through it briefly. We've divided it up by facility type, so you see homes and centers, and have listed the roles across the side. It's color-coded, so if you're going to end up sharing this down the road as we continue to finalize it, just keep in mind that it looks best in color. If you don't print it in color, it's more difficult to follow. The purple shaded area is about the education standards that we have per position. So if you look down, this is the proposed WAC right now as it relates to each role. And so you can see, for example, the ECE short certificate, the initial certificate as it ties to each of the roles. Also included are the age requirements for that position, and then a section for years of experience. We actually only specify years of experience when talking about the center director or the program supervisor in the WAC, the draft WAC right now. In the peach kind of pink section, depending on how it's showing up on your screen, are all of the pre-service requirements as it relates to training for each of the roles. The X's mean if you need to have it or not, and then the bold dots that you see right above that indicate if it's a requirement that has been specified within CCDF. So if it doesn't have that, then you'll notice it might say DEL or CFOC, and that means that there might be a reason why DEL is requiring it in addition to. So for example, safe sleep is a part of our WAC, so that's a DEL requirement. Or it's a recommendation by Caring for Our Children, such as medication management and prevention of shaken baby. When we look at that full list, it is really inclusive of the specific titles that are new, so you can see some things as standalone, such as medication management, and then some are clusters of information. So Child Care Basics includes 10 modules, and so it may be as we continue to work through this pre-service planning that we cluster some of these together. But right now we want to draw emphasis to what are the new areas and what's the new content that we have to make sure we go over. The blue section is what would be required of a professional after they've already entered the field and after they've already completed their pre-service requirements. So they need to complete a Safe Sleep annual renewal of that training, which would be available to them. And then medication management is also going to require a renewal period. We're looking at embedding the Level 2 Early Achievers trainings within this area, and so that would be called Enhancing Quality Training Series. That's our name for it right now, but what that really is bringing in the Early Achievers Level 2 trainings as part of the ongoing training requirements. So if you were a new provider or just jumping on this pathway or progression through training, you may have completed all of your pre-service requirements, and then in the next year done your Safe Sleep annual renewal, medication, and then in the next couple of years start working on the Enhancing Quality Training Series. We're anticipating that will be about a 20-hour series focusing in on leveraging content as it relates to early achievers, but then also what we know about enhancing quality. We want to include topics such as developmental screening, supporting dual language learners, and then keeping some of the current topics that are in Early Achievers Level 2. After someone completes that full training series, then they would continue kind of on their own more so with hours of continuing education, the in-service training annually, and we also want to support them with information that we know of or hear as best practice. Two areas that are really critical that comes up as common themes is supporting providers with information on leadership and business practices, as well as supporting information on child development. So I have a small revision that I want to make to this chart. We've decided in a previous feedback that we want to take off CPR and first aid from that section. Because of the timelines, we can't really be certain how long the certification is going to last. This makes it seem as if we know that in advance, and we don't. So this would be just a renewal timeline cycle for leadership and business practices, as well as a child development component of some sort. Serving homeless children is kind of hanging out there as a standalone piece because it's a training that we do need to develop, but it's the only topic in previous conversations with the advisory committees that didn't make it into the PEACH section as a pre-service requirement, but was something that we wanted people to have within their in-service work. Are there any questions so far? So as you look through the chart, you can see some checkbox, or X's I should say, there on who needs what. We have, and I'll talk about this more in a few minutes, received a lot of feedback, especially at the level of an aide and a volunteer, that we maybe stop and think about what the impact would be on the field if they needed all of this training. So we may do some shifting, especially of that bottom row, to free up the expectations for maybe a parent volunteer who's going to come in and would not have the pre-service requirements at this level, and clarify the difference between an aide when they're supporting maybe a cleanup or custodial type aide versus an instructional aide. At the very bottom, there's a glossary of terms, some of which that I've covered. The one that I haven't yet is the word enrolled. In the WAC, you'll see an area where it says that a person, usually in the role of an aide or a volunteer, needs to be enrolled. And that's to specify that, and you'll see it here on the purple section, that if you're younger than, if you're in school, if you're a school-age person in K-12 or in high school or in college, that you are enrolled.
Angela, we lost you again. Angela, we lost you again.
That is so strange. Any better?
Yeah, it's better.
Oh, and that's just to say that you're enrolled in a program and making sure that you're on track. The key there is kind of intense. It has a lot of symbols, and what that's mapping back to is the very top of the page where you have the columns on the training to indicate minimum health and safety requirements as specified in WAC or CCDF do not count for STARS hours, and there are some specific other details there about, you know, you may not need administering medication if you're not administering medication, and that you have 2 years to complete the Enhancing Quality Training Series, and you can kind of look through those on your own.
So the chart that Angel is referring to been attached to the email that's been sent to all of you with the invites to the webinar as a PDF file. We just have one of the people who are attending the meeting asking where she can find the chart. So there have been 2 separate handouts that have been attached with a PowerPoint with a presentation. One of them is the professional development chart, and another one is the age difference matrix. Just go back to your email and open it from there.
So this chart is a work in progress as we continue to refine anything that we decide to make changes to based on the feedback we've been hearing, and I'll go over that feedback here more in a second. And it's a place where it's easy to manipulate based on the qualifications that we're asking depending on the role.
We have a question, Angela. Does the early child education short certificate require a high school diploma as a prerequisite?
Actually, you can get into college without a high school diploma and complete a degree without a high school diploma. Once you're admitted, you can make it pretty far within the community and technical college system without that. It's not very known that that's the case, and no, you do not need a high school diploma to be able to complete the stackable certificates. So if we want to go to the next slide, one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot is it's very clear that we have a lot of goals for professional development. No matter where we land nationally, we see a lot of the research, the trends, CCDF requirements are asking us to think more creatively on how can we continue to develop the workforce, how can we continue to create certificates and degrees that are valuable to the field, that are progressive, and that really mean something for advancing our work. Knowing that we have so many requirements, whether they're federal actual requirements or things that we want to work on based on best practice for education and qualifications, a big consideration and a big question that we receive often is, how is this going to work? And we agree that implementation is going to be key, that we need to be able to think creatively and support communities as much as possible to meet the needs of providers. That means, you know, mentorship within communities, working with higher education partners to establish programs that maybe are not there yet, and we receive a lot of questions about that and are trying to continue to work with communities on getting that feedback on what would work best to be able to meet the needs of the populations we're serving. We know that there's a lot of people in the field who are experienced providers, and maybe they've had a lot of many years of experience, and maybe they're close to many people are close to wanting to retire from the field, and to ask them to continue on with their commitments to pursuing their education, that might not be their interest. And so we want to be able to think about that and support that. The slide that you see here, I realize there's a lot of text, but the value in this is in bold black. Here are some of, and this is just a few of the questions we receive on an ongoing basis. And many of these maybe are ones that we've all had ourselves is, you know, what else counts? It looks very prescriptive in what we're seeing in the WAC. How can we make sure that we can do this within the implementation timeline? The reason for sharing this with you is I wanted to draw attention to some of the work that's happening on the back end to ensure that implementation can be done as successfully as possible, and that we have mechanisms in place for continuous improvement as we hear feedback back from the field as we move along. So we're looking at doing some crosswalks, and this is under the education piece, about what else counts, between what is equivalent to the credentials that we're showing in WAC. So if it says the initial certificate, what else might count? Right now, if you look on our website and you see what counts as an ECE degree, you see a lot of other topics. So you might see a degree in human development, for example, counts as an ECE degree. And we want to make sure that we're very transparent about what counts in addition to what they see in the WAC. The implementation timeline is something that we've received a lot of feedback on, and we've also received a lot of feedback on from the field about, is this going to work? Do we have the capacity to meet this timeline? And it seems kind of fast. When we look at the actual jump for a family child care provider, let's say, for example, if they are coming in with an initial certificate, which has been the preferred method of meeting the current education requirement, the difference is 2 classes. And if you're coming in without that, the difference would be the initial certificate plus the short, which is only 2 classes more than the initial. The initial is 12 credits. And so what we want to be able to do is really help providers and community understand what the impact is and the amount of time. I think we see credentials and we're not really sure how many credits that includes, but the full stackable certificate is a total of 47 credits, which for the average full-time student would be, or for the average student who went full-time would be 1 year. We understand that most people might not do that, so it would give them, you know, a few years to get started and get that completed. Under the third bullet on the education column for an experienced provider, I talked a little bit about this, but just we want to be able to recognize people who have been in the field for a long time and take into consideration their licensing and professional development history. And then the last one on the education column is for providers who may be refugees or immigrants to the country and do not have a means of collecting their educational transcripts, that we provide them a method to have an extension or an additional timeline waiver to meet the WAC requirement. We do have systems and policies in place right now to look at foreign transcripts, and that's assuming they're available. We do understand that that's not always the case, and they're not always available, even if they've been completed. Under pre-service, this is just really thinking about the training that is required before employment, and a question that we get often is looking at these two pieces, especially in the center, is, but what if I already get some of this training? What if I'm already in, and you can fill in the gap, in ECAP, in Head Start, in something else, and I either already receive it or I already provide it to my staff? We're working on doing a crosswalk between the core competencies, which is the foundation of our professional development system, our core knowledge and skills, and tying that to pre-service requirements, the initial certificate, and then standards within ECAP and Head Start to see maybe people are meeting these in creative ways, and instead of saying you have to do it again, how can we recognize the good work that's already happening? So this would allow us to make sure that we're leveraging our system and intersecting where it's meaningful. Hiring new staff, a big question too is that it feels very difficult to know that we're going to be able to meet the requirements with new staff. And we just completed, and we're working on a summary for this, but a survey to many providers in the field and contractors, ECAP contractors, on what is your experience hiring staff? Is there a workforce shortage? Why are people leaving? Where are they going? Do you know? And so we're compiling that data now, and we should have some more information on that. But we also want to make sure that we're revisiting the qualifications, especially for volunteers and aides, as I mentioned, and making sure that we're streamlining any supports that they receive early on in a way that recognizes completion, as noted above, if they're already in a program that's offering that training, and that we're giving consideration to that. The other thing that we hear often is, I already know this. I could teach this course, or I could test out of it if there were a way. Why is this not more competency-based? And that's something that we want to really think about, is how can we identify policies for competency-based professional development. We do that somewhat now, and we have higher ed has policies for credit for prior learning, but we want to continue to think about, is there anything that we can do internally if someone does have the knowledge and skills of an expectation that we have as it relates to training. And then the other thing I think on the in-service side that I'd like to just emphasize is that when someone is enrolled in a higher education program, we want to recognize the work that we're doing, and I don't think DEL has done a very clear job of saying, if you are on track or enrolled in participating in higher ed, working towards a certificate or degree, that counts for your WAC requirements for in-service training. So the 10 hours that you do now, if you were enrolled in college and working on a degree, that would count. You don't need to take more, but we need to really make sure that we're messaging that and supporting people in choosing that option if that's something that they want to do, so that they don't feel like they have to do double. We also know that we have, as we continue to develop the workforce with credentials and degrees, the need for training that's tied to the higher level of core competencies, like levels 4 and 5. We want to make sure that we have enough trainings available in communities for those who may have bachelor's or master's degrees to feel like they can go and complete something that fits their needs. So the reason for me sharing this with you is just to really highlight that we're getting a wide amount of questions from the field, and we want to make sure that we're thinking about ways that we can put supports in place and or address our policies to account for those areas while still supporting the growing workforce needs and implementing best practice around qualifications and training requirements. Any questions so far?
Yes, we do have some questions, so I will start reading them. Have you done an analysis of, one, The first question, cost of teacher provider. Second, capacity of community colleges. 3, funding needed at community colleges. 4, number of staff who will need to have their credentials upgraded. And 5, availability of sufficient instructors at community college level. So let's start with the first one. Analysis of cost for teachers providers.
Analysis of teachers and providers.
Cost for teachers providers. Cost of education for teachers providers, I guess.
Oh, okay, I see. Yes. So we do know the cost of, for example, a degree. We do know the current status of our workforce and how many people would need those degrees. So we've done some cost analysis, especially as it relates to scholarship funding, because that's, I think, what the question is getting at, is how do we support the workforce of where we currently are to get them to this proposed state. And so as we're looking at that, the other thing that we're thinking about is, and how do we support the increasing capacity that's needed with ECAP expansion, which is a whole another cost analysis that we're working on. So we do know the cost of degrees. We do know that it does take a substantial contribution to make sure that we have scholarship funds to retain our existing workforce, and we're prepared for making sure that's a part of this. The other thing that DEL is in the middle of is a cost of quality analysis, and we want to make sure that the cost of quality is inclusive of the educational levels of providers and educators. So it's not enough to say the cost of quality is the equipment that you might have in your facility, or the cost of quality includes, you know, I don't know, a new playground, piece of playground, or for example, or anything that's tied to the environmental rating scale and early achievers. The cost of quality is also the cost of hiring and retaining and providing professional development to staff. So that work is underway. I think that we want to make sure that as we're doing this, we have the resources to support that. This also ties into our scholarship model, because we want to make sure that we're leveraging the supports that we do have, because we do have funding for scholarships for those who maybe need it most, or who can be most successful with certain program models, so that we can keep retention of scholarship and maximize the use of scholarship funds, not lose funds based on maybe someone not completing a program. So that's also something that we're taking into account. The question that kind of piggybacks on that is, well, okay, let's say we do have the scholarship funds, and let's say people are interested in doing that. Do colleges and universities have the capacity, and are the instructors prepared to do this, and the colleges prepared to do this, and is the level of instruction at colleges sufficient? That's something that's definitely been on our radar as well. When we think about the preparation of educators, the preparation of teachers, that all goes into account of that. How are we making sure that people are leaving the higher education system with the knowledge and skills that they think they're getting, and that we're paying for through scholarships, and that the whole system needs to have? We are considering developing a council, a board, something to support some of this. In early learning, we don't require teacher certification like the K-12 world does, and we don't have a lot of checks and balances for higher ed to say, when a student graduates, they must be X, Y, and Z. They do adopt our core competencies, so we do have alignment there, and the stackable certificates are common learning outcomes across the board, across community and technical colleges. But once you start leaving the stackable certificates, then it starts getting a little bit more diverse on what colleges are doing, and they still have academic freedom to be able to provide that the way they want to, and so there's this need for maybe a little bit more structure in that area. And right now we've had strong interest from the colleges to support that. And so I think we're at a really unique time where all of the colleges, both community and state 4-year, are really interested in supporting the workforce. It is difficult.
Angela, we're losing you again.
Huh?
We're losing you again.
Oh, I'm not really sure why. It is difficult sometimes to find instructors.
It's not better, Angela.
Okay.
Now it's better.
Okay. It's difficult sometimes to find instructors that meet the cultural diversity of our workforce. So if we want to provide, which we do, cohorts or groups in another language, especially Somali and Spanish are most popular sometimes it's hard to find adjunct instructors to be able to deliver those classes, and so I think that continues to be a workforce need that is across the board. We need adjuncts to be able to serve providers, and we need providers to be able to serve children that meet their cultural and linguistic needs, and that's something that is a continued area of focus.
Thank you. The next question is, what about ECAP expansion? Is there a capacity of the system to get multiple people up to associate degree and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, that really ties into the description of earlier with wanting to make sure that we have a mechanism to send people to for degrees. With ECAP, we do have a nearly 50%, whether it's associates or bachelors, that already would meet that requirement. What we don't know right now is what their degree is in. So you could potentially be an ECAP and fall within the roughly half that have that, and maybe your degree is in something else. But that ties back to what's our role at the agency to determine what counts and how do we support someone in case they do not have a degree in ECE. If you have a bachelor's degree in, what's an example, psychology, the intent isn't that you'd have to go get another bachelor's degree. So part of that is the policy work. So we don't have as many as we need to for current ECAP, because that's the current data. We do have a need to recruit over 700 new ECAP providers in the coming years for ECAP expansion, and the capacity that's being built around the state has been at some at the 4-year level, but also with the development of Bachelors of Applied Science in ECE. We have many community colleges now that are working towards, and some are already offering ECE degrees in community colleges that would meet the bachelor's requirement. And so that's fairly new. And then we're continuing to work with our community college partners to ramp up and increase the work that they can provide and the outreach and the support. We're also thinking about this in context with what's happening around K-12 and with McCleary, because we also know that in many cases we're attracting the same people in the field. I mean, if you're new and you're just coming into the field, you might be wanting to decide, do I go into early learning or do I go into K-12? And if you're undecided, at this point, it's open, but we also know that you may go to K-12 because compensation is better. And that's a whole other area that we're wanting to work on, is how do we support compensation? Because when we think about quality, qualifications, and compensation, it's really all together to make sure that the system works efficiently.
So the next question is, how are we honoring the years of STARS training and building blocks? Will we develop something that honors those hundreds of hours? Yeah,
and that gets to when I was thinking about on the previous section, talking about how do we account for providers' previous experience. So the third bullet under education, what is our education waiver policy? How do we offer consideration for licensing compliance and PD completed during years past? So the building bridges is part of the PD completed in years past. Is there a way for us to say, you completed these 3 modules and you completed X number of hours, and the competencies that you've met during that are the same competencies within the initial certificate now? That's hypothetical. We still have to do that work, but we want to be able to honor that. As it relates to STARS hours are not necessarily a currency that articulates directly into credits, but we do want to make sure that we're thinking about what's our policy for credit for prior learning. I don't think I put that listed here. Did I? I don't think so. But that's another thing that we're working on with higher ed, is can we have some more structure for credit for prior learning to make sure that we're accounting for anything that we can in a systematic way across the state. We don't want there to be discrepancies on, if you live in Seattle, for example, and you have more community colleges and you can shop around and you can find the college that's going to package that best for you, which is happening now, versus I live in Wenatchee and I have one college and they're doing, they're only offering me whatever that might be. So that's something that's up for consideration. And then the other is really providing support around what are STARS hours. So STARS hours are the continuing ed, like if you were a lawyer and you go and you do your continuing education units, or if you're a teacher and you're doing your clock hours, that currency is really unique, and just keeping that definition defined as different from a credit-bearing course.
So there are a couple of questions that kind of go together. The first been asked, earlier before you start answering some of the questions. So I think they kind of continuation one of another one. So I will put them together. What kinds of support, financial and otherwise, is Dell planning to offer to support providers in achieving the standards? And I hear you saying we have more work to do to build the capacity of the adult education sector to meet the demand that these requirements would create, and that we're still figuring out what resources are needed to support providers in achieving these requirements. Cost of quality research. Will this research and capacity development occur before the requirements are put in place?
Okay, so the first part, what's happening financially and otherwise to support.
We're losing you again, Angela.
Okay. You okay? Can you hear now? Okay, I think my mouse like goes to sleep and it turns off the webinar because I'm using my computer. So what are the supports that we need? Part of what we're doing right now, and I'm going to introduce a little bit of what we're doing with the culturally responsive professional development, because I feel like this ties in. When we think about the support that adult learners need to be successful in higher education, sometimes it's incentive, sometimes it's, you know, if you do this, we'll reward you with that, which we have with our education awards, and those are available right now through an application of merit where we incentivize the completion of education. But the other part that's a critical need is what are we doing in communities to provide support for those who might not know where to go? How do we work with them to know who their point of contact is within the college? So each of the colleges have a point of contact model for scholarships, so that instead of just, you know, going into the admissions office and you don't know where to go, there's a person in the ECE department who would be your liaison and someone to hold your hand through the process. But sometimes you need someone to help get you through that door. And so I would say support that we're increasing is the outreach for doing that work and increasing the hand-in-hand model. We have some goals within DEL to continue to support that, but then also our Family Child Care Union is interested in that as well and has been a part of bargaining resources on that. And so starting in this fall, we're going to be having, well, actually probably sooner than the fall, here as soon as we have a contract in place, have some additional supports with a 501c3 that was established by the union, and that 501c3 is called the Imagine Institute, to provide some additional outreach and support for family child care providers. We've all learned a lot through this minimum education requirement, both things that have gone well because we have been able to do some great things in the last year or so as we're getting really close to the crunch time, but then also some things that we want to do differently and do as soon as possible with this new WAC requirement. So that's something that's new that will really support family child care providers who are often in need of enhanced support to get through these systems. And then the second part of that question was around research. Will the research be completed by that time? We have some preliminary research already, so I think that's a good thing to point out is we have done a review of early achievers and some of the steps in place needed and the cost of quality early on, and now we're just taking a deeper dive that Vicki and her team's leading on research and wanting to make sure. I don't know if someone else on the call has the timeline. I would need to check in on what that timeline would be, but we do know that by this, by this fall is not going, or spring even, is not going to be ready necessarily, but we do want to support creating an awareness and a pipeline and attracting people to what supports they do have available so that they can start as soon as they're ready.
So there's some clarification in regard of what will be counted or what will be not. I will read it, but I can say that I don't know if I got that. Does it mean if I'm getting an associate degree, I would also need to do my 10 stars hours, or the opposite? It's an opposite. If you are in the process of getting your associate degree and you're enrolled in your coursework could be counted as your annual 10 hours. Will it be correct answer, Angela?
Yes, that's correct.
So then another one is exactly the example of not making Head Start and ECAP directors take 30 hours of child care basics. It's exactly what we're trying not to do. If they have already some level of preparedness and they are participating on ongoing professional development through Head Start and ECAP professional development system, then yes, we will not ask them to continue to take child care basics. So the next question is, do we know how many people statewide have this certificate? With 30,000 that would need done, one, what's the gap? So the question is, do we know the numbers and the data in regard of current providers, qualification and education level? And we presented this data, I believe, some time ago when we started conversation about professional development. So I will take this particular question as the next step, and we can definitely bring back this data so you can review this data and see what percentage of providers, center, and home have what level of qualification, what level of education degrees. So then we can also talk together in regard of what type of timeline we may think about and what number of providers may need to move through the pipeline to what level of degrees. If the next question, if most of the field has to go back for a certificate at the same time, it seems like that would cause a big drop in the demand for STAR's continuing education hours for at least 3 years, because providers will be getting their STAR hours from the certificate courses. Do you think that we will have a big impact on the ECE trainer population? If there is no demand for several years, we might lose a lot of trainers before demand for training rebounds.
I think that definitely there's a possibility. The other thing is, when we look at the data right now on the number of hours that people are taking in training, they are taking well over 10 hours a year, which is quite amazing. You know, people aren't doing just the minimum for the most part. And I think the question has also been too framed in another way previous to this is, with so many free trainings around Early Achievers, when Early Achievers was just rolling out, that counts for continuing education. Would state-approved trainers and training organizations also not have work to do? And we haven't necessarily seen that to be the case either. Even with free trainings offered through Early Achievers, training organizations have still been, you know, doing a lot of effective work. One of the things that we really want to encourage providers to do is to know that you may be pursuing your degree, but if you have other areas of interest that you want to continue to grow in, that we want to support you in those topic areas that you might not be getting at that moment in time through your initial certificate. So we're looking at creating more self-assessments around professional development and solidifying more of a professional development plan that we can offer people as a way to track their learning and to track their goals, and hopefully see an increase in why people are choosing the trainings that they're choosing or their educational path, and not be just based on the minimum education requirements or training requirements that we actually see hasn't been the case so far. People are still doing more.
So the last comment that we have is about that we as Department of Early Learning need to look comprehensively and develop a comprehensive fiscal note in addition to the small business impact, economical impact analysis. So I will also put it in our next steps list because I think it will be helpful to bring available capacity data. So the advisory committee can review what we currently have, what type of capacity data we currently have, and what additional data points we may need to try to have in order to develop a fiscal note that will be satisfactory for this particular ask. So thank you. So now we are going back to the first point of the agenda that we've been hoping to start with, but unfortunately because of the technical glitch couldn't. Sorry, Holly, that we moved agenda around, and I appreciate your flexibility. So now we go into the Thrive by 5, and Holly, who will talk about community feedback report.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm really happy to talk to everybody about this today. So this is the process that we engaged with communities to talk about the proposed standards. So between April 12th and May 25th, there were 23 meetings throughout the state, 4 languages, English, Russian, Somali, and Spanish. We do want to note, there were dozens of people who participated from different sectors, different types of providers, different agencies, community-based organizations. But we also recognize that this is not the whole universe of feedback on the standards. This was an attempt through the coalitions to understand a little bit more about the impact of these standards on cultural humility and racial equity, and also to get a little bit of a understanding about some implementation priorities that might emerge, and so that was a big part of the feedback that came out through this process. So the way that it worked was the coalitions were the hosts and facilitators. They worked with community partners to tell people about the meetings, recruit attendees. Thrive and Dell provided resources for them and some orientation webinars and facilitation summaries they could use, but they made a lot of choices locally about what was going to work for them. And we learned a lot through this process, and this is only one stage, and so there's things we might do differently, coalitions might want to do differently. It wasn't 100, we don't always get it 100%, but we feel really good about the way that we were able to bring in a wide swath of people, and the coalitions were able to take leadership on that. And in some cases, they did bring in racial equity experts to facilitate the meetings, depending on what they had available to them. So that you can go to the next slide. So how did we actually collect the feedback? This was quite an undertaking. So notes were captured in every meeting on easel paper and handouts and things like that. And then all those notes were transcribed, categorized, and coded by Thrive staff. And we did standard by standard, meeting by meeting. So we have transcribed notes from every meeting on every standard. But we also, one of the coalitions that did at least one meeting in Spanish, they also created more of a formalized report, so we were also able to use that. So what we did was draft a report, and I'm going to be sending this to you today, Luba, a draft of the report. So the report incorporated every comment, either verbatim or in essence. And there's an important reason for that, and that is what I kind of mentioned before. We feel like this was a really good way to get a lot of feedback across the state in a short amount of time. But that doesn't mean that we heard from everyone, right? There's things we might not have heard, and we also don't know, we can't discount a comment because it was only made once. We don't know if there would have been more people who would have supported that, but they didn't have a chance to weigh in. And so it was important that we really capture everything and cast the widest net, and not make decisions ourselves about what was the most important comment or what should be emphasized. What we were able to do, though, is come up with a summary of the feedback for each standard, and kind of categorize the feedback in between changes in proposed standards and then also suggested priorities for implementation. There was a pretty clear breakdown there between the types of feedback. One was, could actually be, wordsmithing what's in the standard versus others that are about the support that's needed once the standard is enacted. So 2 types of feedback that way. And then there were a lot of themes that came out that were really about implications across the system. So things that really are beyond the scope of the standards alignment process or even childcare overall in some cases. And we wanted to make sure that was reflected as well, because there were a lot of bigger themes that came up about connecting to, referring to other systems and the connection to a child's medical home and other things like that. So those types of themes came up. So we drafted this report to hold all of these pieces, and the coalitions were given 2 opportunities actually to review the draft. We showed them an early draft and incomplete draft to make sure that the structure and the way that we were approaching the content was right, so kind of a check-in. And then we also gave them an opportunity to review the draft report this week actually, so that they could validate. And what we've heard so far is that they feel like the structure and the content itself resonates and aligns with what they experienced in the meetings. So that's all on process. Are there any questions on process before I get into the actual content? Okay. Great. All right, we'll move on. So if you can go to the next slide. Great, thanks. So there's, and this is interesting going after Angela, because there's a lot of things she mentioned that actually will come up here. So some of the key themes. There were a few comments. There were a lot of comments about that the proposed standards demonstrate good intentions. That there's, this is really good in theory, and the participants really liked the potential for high quality access for everyone. But over and over again, we heard, where is the support that's going to allow this to happen, that's going to help providers comply with these standards. So everything from, money that would, like, where does the money come from, to, go back to school or to pay more for more educated staff members and things like that. Technical assistance and guidance on working with families or finding educational opportunities, and then materials, things even as simple as, we don't have the resources to print out the handouts that would be required to refer parents to a different, to some extra service that they might need, or, with regard to family support. So there's a lot of, a huge range, and there's a lot more detail in the report about the types of supports that providers might need. And the participants also, these meetings were focused on racial equity and cultural humility, and the participants called out that providers of color, family child care providers in particular, who are providers of color, will have less access to the supports that will allow them to be successful with the proposed standards. We know that there's disproportionate outcomes in education, and the standards propose higher educational standards for providers. So just really breaking down some of these systemic challenges that are faced by people of color and what that's going to look like for them to be able to comply. Translation. So this came up a lot, both for providers and for families. Where are the resources? Folks were saying, where are the proposed, like, can you translate the proposed standards so we can give better feedback on them? And then, everything else that would go along with actually enacting the standards, or what that would look like in reality. They were wanting to see resources for translation so that it would be easier to communicate both for the providers and for families. And then another big theme that came up was about ensuring that families can continue to have autonomy and, have an opportunity to collaborate with providers and feel like their voice is being heard, and that their cultures are being honored, or their choices are being honored. So how do you create that space for those conversations when families are facing a lot of challenges? How do you make that work? And make something, this balance between, and I saw this over and over in the feedback, this balance between being equitable and trying to be, include everyone, but also, there's a certain sort of standardization that comes along with that. And so how do you actually allow some of that, that back and forth to happen, and some of the customization? And then finally, the systemic challenges, as I mentioned before. There's all these other systems that interact with families. And so despite, we could make the best standards in the world, but without all the other pieces around it, how is that actually going to work in practice? And there's a lot, health came up a lot, K-12 came up a lot, higher education with regard to providers' pursuit of education, and social services, right? When we talk about developmental screening, for example, if there does need to be a referral, what's available to families. So those were the key themes that came up. And then there's a few more things I wanted to share on the next slide. So these were the particular issues that were very, people were pretty strong in their language, or a little bit more heated, or were a little bit more contentious even among the participants. So again, things that have come up already on this call: cost and time for providers to achieve higher educational standards, and the accessibility of it. So whether it's language barriers or geographic barriers, or things like that. How are providers to achieve some of these higher educational standards? And the perception that more value is placed on educational background than experience. So that came up again and again. There's quotes like, I'm 50 years old. Do you really want me to go back to college? Things like that. So there's this. Where does experience, how is experience valued? And they wanted to see that more, or maybe in the implementation they would like to see more that experience is valued and acknowledged. Also recording data. This came up in a lot of different ways, but there's just questions about, where does that data go? Does Dell hold that? Does the provider hold that? How does that work? How is it kept private? It came up in ways, things like, if a child is expelled, is there a record of that somewhere? And then do they have to disclose that to the next provider they go to? Or, things, so just a lot of questions about how data moves around and who keeps it and what's private or confidential and what's not. And then the space and time for communication and collaboration with families. So this came up especially in the family support component, and also a little bit in talking about expulsion and restraint. So there's some requirements in there about confidential space to have discussions with families, and how does that work with ratio? So if I have to go have a conversation with a parent in a private space, who's watching the children during that time, and what if I don't have that space? What if I'm a family child care provider and that space isn't available? Or, can I have some space that usually isn't private, but I can kind of make it private in the moment that I need to have a conversation? So a lot of logistical concerns around how to do those components the best way possible. And then also related to that, to conversations, setting mutual expectations and finding common ground with families. And so providers looking for a lot of guidance, support, coaching on approaching families with really difficult conversations, related to developmental screening, related to the food that the child is eating, or what they're drinking. These things can be very tough to talk about with families potentially, and so especially if there is a language or culture divide. And so wanting to have more guidance on how to do that better. And then finally, this is something that is a little bit beyond my my area of expertise, but I just saw this theme come up a lot around those providers that are part of early achievers and those that aren't, and a perception about what it takes to be in early achievers or be successful in early achievers, and the supports that come along with that. And so feeling like there was this divide between who has access to early achievers, who is successful in early achievers, and that there's resources that should be available to more providers. So that's my summary for now, and I'm happy to take questions.
So Holly, we don't have any questions so far.
Oh, great.
So I will let people kind of process, because it's a lot of information, and by the end of the webinar we possibly may have more questions or comments.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if not, again, because it's a lot to process right now, so will it be fine if we will ask advisory committee members to contact you directly if there will be specific questions about the report? And also I would like to move to the next steps, the review of the report. So as soon as you will submit reports to the department, I will release reports for the advisory committee review. So then by the next meeting, all advisory committee members will have an access and will have time to review the report. So at the next meeting, we can have a more specific, more precise conversation about some of the ideas, comments, or questions about the report or data that's actually been behind the report. Will it be fine?
Great. Yep, that sounds good to me, and I will be sending you the report today.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate your help with that.
Yep.
And also please share our appreciation with Early Learning Coalition.
Absolutely.
For all that help behind the standards alignment process.
Great.
Yes. So we're moving to the differences in age definitions conversation, and unfortunately Debbie, she just texted me that she doesn't have a chance to connect due to some issues. She's at conference right now, and it seems like she's having a hard time to connect to the webinar. So I will help to walk us through this particular conversation. Just keep in mind that it's a conversation. We're just providing you with the information per your request, looking at the differences in age definitions. You have to pull from your email a second chart, a second handout, which is looking at differences in age definitions for different children age groups. And I will give you a little bit of time to do that. So what we've been trying to do, we've been trying to look at the specific age groups as infant, young infants, older infants, enhanced toddlers, toddler, preschool age child, preschooler, age 3 to 4, age 4 to 5, age 5, and kindergarten, non-school age child, school age child. And we developed this list of age definitions based on particular documents or particular policies and sometimes procedures that using these particular definitions. Not all of the documents that we're referencing in this matrix use all of them, but we just kind of develop a list of what all of those documents are using. So we'll look at WAC and RCW. We'll look at the new WAC alignment definitions and the progression definitions. We'll look at the early learning guidelines. Caring for our children, the latest editions. Also subsidy rates for centers and breakdown in ages by subsidy WAC. And subsidy rates for family homes breakdown by, again, by the subsidy WAC. So this is what we looked at and made some kind of a, don't want to say comparison, but just mapped those definitions and try to see the differences. And as you see, the differences are pretty big. So the discrepancies across several programs with the age brackets, including how subsidy payments are made, and how we're looking at the age groups programmatically versus from the subsidy perspective. And I will again give you a little bit of time to screen through. So my question to you will be how we would like to approach it. What does it mean for us? Because even in WAC and ECAP, we have two different definitions of preschool. ECAP preschool definition considered from 36 to 48 months. So what will be your ideas for resolving these issues? Please type your ideas. We will look at the next slide. And kind of our thinking is to definitely go to ELAC and go to Early Achievers Review Subcommittee, and we're also asking you as the Alignment Advisory Committee how to approach it and how to develop possibly an action plan regarding what to do with all of the differences and definitions, and possibly do we need to align it or not, or we are fine with how it is for now. Also thinking about possible impacts that changes of some definitions or alignment of the definitions may bring to the field. Any ideas so far? The question is the goal to have consistent definitions in all regulations? One consideration is definitions used by FES. Do we want to be identical? It's a great idea. What we would like to hear from you, do we want to have aligned definitions? We definitely would like to have an aligned definition, but again, thinking about the possible impact that it may cause. And right now, I'm thinking about the impact to the ratios and group sizes that we currently have in licensing regulation. And we already discussed the possible impacts when we looked at their centers, mixed age groupings, and also look at the center's capacity, group sizes, and it's where we recognize that the impact to their, specifically to small businesses, will be pretty significant if we will immediately align our definitions with the federal definitions, or even be more close to caring for our children. And I just would like to mention that actually it's one of the not so many missing alignments with caring for our children, as well as with CCDF requirements, CCDF grant requirements that we have in the state. We are not meeting the CCDF perspective based on the caring for our children, how ratios and group sizes need to be organized. So we have some other ideas. I believe we should follow the early learning guidelines for the ages. I have always felt our toddler ages are not best practice. Send it soon, yes, to align, define the impacts, 0 to 11 months, infant 12 months to 3 years, toddler 3 years to kindergarten, preschool. So again, aligning with how federal regulations, Head Start, early Head Start regulations, looking at their standards, not regulation standards, looking at their age groups. Would the new definitions impact the ratios? If the definition of infant changes for family child care, does it mean that they would be able to have more young toddlers that currently count as infants? It's a good question. Yes, I do believe that as we will, it depends on how we will define it, if we will align with FED, then yes, it will impact the group size and ratios, because if we will look at the federal requirements for infants and toddlers, which is from 0 up to 36 months, then the group size, if infant is a part of the group, will be counted by the youngest requirement. So then the group size wouldn't go more than 8 children with 2 adults in a classroom or in a group. So yes, absolutely, those are the impacts that we need to consider, and dependencies that we need to consider. We definitely could break up down toddler to younger and older toddlers. Is what actually caring for our children suggesting to do. And there are different group sizes and ratios for younger and older toddlers. I don't think CDF does have requirements for that. No, CDF doesn't have a requirement for that, but there are some considerations that the states have taken in regard of that caring for our children is a guidelines which is behind the CCDF requirements. There's agreement that preschool should be 36 months, not 30 months, and we all know that it's a big difference between 30-month-old child and a 36-month child, but again, it will be then an impact to the group size and ratios, and then it will be economical impact on center and home providers. So I know that there are a number of advocates organizations who are a part of this webinar right now. So this is something that maybe advocate organizations can help us to think about, because we know that a number of definitions coming from RCWs, and it will not be possible, as already discussed through the conversation about group sizes and capacities and ratios, that it will not be possible for us to change the rules per se, till we will go to the legislation and open a conversation about changing the definitions. So people who represent, members of the advisory committee who represent advocacy organizations on the call today, may we hear from you? What is your stand on it? Would you be able to support this idea? And maybe bring this information of these discrepancies to the legislation to showcase how inconsistent we are currently. We have one more comment. If the changes limit the group size based on the youngest child, it seems like there would need to be a big increase in the subsidy rates for infants and possibly even the eligibility for families with infants. It would make it really suboptimal to have an infant if the rate for them cannot cover the hit total capacity. Yes, it's one, absolutely. It's one of the dependencies that we need to consider and impact that we need to consider, because we currently already have a shortage, a big shortage on serving infants in the state. So we don't have so far any comments from members of the advisory committee who represent advocacy organizations. So maybe the next step will be in this conversation. I will put it on the next meeting agenda, and we will do our best to follow up with advocacy organizations and maybe at ELA meeting to start this conversation, because ELA kind of gathering majority of advocacy organizations who represent interests of the early learning in the state, and ask them to put it on their agenda and bring it to the early learning community for conversation. So I hope that ELA will be open to help us with that. So with this, I will move to the updates. And I really appreciate, because when we've been talking about professional development, actually we've been complimented for having an idea of moving forward with a small business economic impact analysis and statement that we have to develop. But thank you for the compliment, and it's a requirement that we have to fulfill that accompany any type of rulemaking. So as we're just entering this process, I wanted to share with you the initial information so you will know what actually the department is required to do and what are the possible exemptions that we will have to consider. So as many of you know, we have to prepare the small business economic impact statement for any type of rulemaking. And small business means any business that has fewer than 50 employees and is independently operated. And those are the minor costs that we need to consider when we are approaching the economic impact analysis. There are some of the exemptions. If we will go to the next slide, there are some of the exemptions that we need to look at. And I would like you to be aware of those exemptions from preparing a small business economic impact statement. And I'm not saying that we will not do, we will, but I just will like you to know about the exemptions. So with this, I would like to give you like a very approximate timeline. We need to submit the small business economic impact statement by November of this year. So starting from August is what we will be heavily involved in analyzing all of the data points in order to create a decent analysis of how different standards, as again now we have content that we can analyze how this particular requirement may impact the well-being of the small businesses, home and center providers. So this is what we will start analyzing, and we would like to keep you fully involved and fully informed. And it will be ongoing standing item in our agenda from next meeting up to the time of submission. And it's where a lot of data points will be brought to your attention in regards of what type of data we're considering and what type of data we're possibly missing or may not have consistent and so on. Any questions, comments, concerns, suggestions about the small business economic impact statement? So let's go to the questions, because there have been some questions that we need to follow up before we will get to Early Achievers and ECAP updates. So thank you, Children's Alliance. They agreed to help with a conversation about inconsistencies of our definitions and age groups. Thank you. And ELA is a good place to discuss it. And I agree that it's one of the places that we will need to for sure look at the dependencies and it's what actually Children's Alliance is referring to, that the number of analysis will have to be done in regards of different dependencies, how our decisions of aligning definitions or changing definitions may impact businesses and well-being of the businesses, as well as access and supply of parents and families to different type of services. I question if this age descriptions need to be the same for home versus center. It makes more sense with centers to be more consistent, where home has a wide variety of ages. Yes, it's true for current WACs, because in current regulations and current licensing rules, we're allowing for mixed age grouping in homes only. But with the new proposed rules draft, we are also allowing centers to start thinking about how to do mixed age grouping. You have to be, if you're a center who would like to do it, we will allow center only at level 3 in Early Achievers or higher, but still it will also possibly will start impacting centers who will start considering to do mixed age grouping. So what I'm trying to say, we need to look at both, at homes, how it will impact family homes, as well as centers. There's a huge number, I'm reading the next comment, there are a huge number of possible iterations on this chart, is what I mean. If you guys are thinking more specifically about something that would be good to know. We're not thinking specifically about anything, honestly. This request has been made through the advisory committee WAC draft reviews that happened a couple of weeks ago. This question been brought in a couple of meetings, and we didn't discuss it in length, so we just decided per your request, for the advisory committee request, to put it together for your review and ask you what you would like to do with that. We are not planning to do with it anything before we will consult with advocacy organizations, as well as hear from you if you would like to do something with, if you would like department to do something about it. Are you also in process on an analysis of what kind of additional funds they will need to ask for to implement each part? So if we're talking about additional support that could be needed for each content area or each standard, as we know, majority of the standards language is the same without changes. We're definitely looking at analyzing what type of possible impact some of the new CCDF requirements have been embedded into the WAC draft, how it may impact the field, as well as additional caring for our children or DEL approved enhancements that have been implemented to WAC draft, and one of them is safe sleep or conversation about serving infants as young as from their birth, and all of nurse consultation for homes and centers. So things like that. Definitely we are analyzing the possible impact and what type of support the providers will need in order to achieve the requirement. Or developmental screening, who will provide information about where to refer to what particular organizations to refer the providers, so they will be able to refer families for developmental screenings and things like that. And I really appreciate all the help that we've been getting. So thankful for all the help that we've been getting from the union, from SAIU, and appreciate the offer to help with the age groups and chime into this conversation. Thank you. We will loop you in. And yes, we're also, those are dependencies, how it may possibly impact the age, the group sizes and capacity of the providers, and if it will impact capacity of the providers, how it will impact the supply and offerings for different age groups that parents and families will be able to access. And again, I appreciate Children's Alliance willingness and the union willingness to help us with this conversation. So we will let you know more as soon as this conversation will happen. It's ELA, and also this conversation will happen with the union. We will let you know. Maybe we will need to organize a separate work group or to tackle this particular issue. Thank you. So with this, I will ask Rachel to chime in and talk more about what is going with early achievers and ECAP progression, the rest of the progression development of the standards. Thank you, Rachel.
Great.
You can chime in. Yep.
Thank you, Luba. So as you see on the slide here, the Early Achievers team, the ECAP team, and the licensing team have been working together to develop a nice comprehensive timeline to guide our progression drafting and review. So we're in the process of developing a timeline which incorporates how we're going to write the standards for early achievers, how we're going to get that to the ECAP team, how the licensing groups are going to be participating in the drafting and the reviewing of that information, how we're going to get that information through our leadership at DEL as well as out to the advisory committee. So it's quite a braided timeline, I'll say. There are a lot of different stakeholders that are involved in that process, and so it's taken a little bit of time to work that out. We've also been spending time identifying roles and responsibilities within each of the teams to determine who's going to be doing writing, who's going to be doing reviewing, etc. And also talking about how do we create documents that can be used as a resource for our internal writing process. Do we have all the things that we need? Are there different resource documents that we will need to create to support the review by the advisory committee as we move forward, as well as the community? Just being mindful of all the things that have been created as we've been working on the draft WAC and thinking about how we might be able to enhance that experience going forward, as well as obviously writing the progressions. That's the next phase of stepping in and doing that writing. And also identifying stakeholder populations that will be targeted for the input and review process. So it'll be really important for us to get broad community input as well as input from, providers who are participating in both early achievers as well as ECAP. Any questions about any of that? Okay, so looks like we've moved on to the timeline slide. So you can see July coordinating our efforts within DEL and working on writing the early achievers and the ECAP draft progressions is beginning. In August, we will continue writing the early achievers and ECAP drafts. And the first section of the ECAP revisions will be out for review. There are certain parts of ECAP that are not contingent upon early achievers, and so they're working on those pieces while we're getting a group of early achiever standards ready for that team to review. In September, we'll continue writing ECAP and early achievers drafts, and we'll get that information out to you to review and out to the community for review. And then in October, the writing of the ECAP drafts is complete. Additional ECAP sections will be out for review, and early achievers drafts will be out for review. So the early achievers and the ECAP piece, I think the important thing to note is that they're really working in concert, and so it's really important that our teams are developing the draft together and then receiving that feedback together, so we're able to make those modifications. Because, you know, Early Achievers is a flexible system where you can select which standards you're opting into as a provider, but within Early Achievers, or not within ECAP, excuse me, those standards are set and their requirements, and so there may be pieces that live within Early Achievers that are required for ECAP providers or providers who are supplying ECAP services, and so it's really important that we're working in very fine coordination. In November, the final sections of the ECAP drafts will be up for review, and we will create a community and stakeholder feedback report based on all the information that has been collected. And then in December, the goal is to finalize the revisions and the progressions of the Early Achievers and ECAP standards. It's a very ambitious timeline. Just want to say that. But we're very excited to be engaged in the work.
Any questions, comments on the Early Achievers and ECAP work and the timeline? So please contact Rachel and Kelly or Nicole if you do have some concerns or questions or suggestions how to approach it or offer your support in helping specifically with community engagement and all of the feedback that they're looking forward to have from the community. So with this, let's look at our next steps. So I will let you know what I've collected so far for throughout our conversation, and if I'm missing something, please remind me about it. So the first point is we need to bring back the workforce education qualification data for review and further discussion to see what percentage of what type of providers and center staff we have at what particular education level. So what level of support, how much time we possibly may need just looking to move them to the higher level of education or qualification, and how to approach it. Just bring back this conversation that we've been having some time ago. Also bring to your attention available capacity data, and we're talking about capacity not only the current provider workforce, but also capacity of the systems that support the providers, higher ed, community colleges, scholarships, union, and so on. So what type of support we have in place, and what is the level of capacity of available support, and what additional things we need to think about based on the feedback report that Holly been presenting to us today. Then actually the feedback report will be brought to your attention next week. Holly will send it to me today, and I will send it to you next week. And you will have time to review it and formulate your comments, questions, suggestions. Please contact me or Holly or Dan during this month before the next meeting if you have additional questions or would like to have more information. But we would like to bring back this conversation to the meeting in August to review some of your comments and also look at the additional data points that the feedback report may suggest us to consider while we are still finalizing the standards. And the age differences conversation, age definitions differences conversation. So I will be in contact with Children's Alliance and ELA and also with the SAIU to figure out how we can combine our efforts in developing some type of action plan how to tackle this particular issue, and also start looking at possible data points that we may bring to our conversation at the advisory committee meeting, so we can continue also loop you in and hear your voices and what we need to consider while we're trying to develop some plan around it. So we have a couple of more comments before we will adjourn. And I will be more than open to read those comments. I cannot say that I agree with all of them, but I think they're definitely food for thought for all of us, and how we're communicating and how we are considering our actions and how we are structuring our activities. So the perception of what we do will not create additional angst in the community. So the first comment is it will be very important to make something easier, not more difficult for providers. It will be great to define something because it's very vague saying something. We believe we're trying to focus on children and make children's lives better and successful by preparing them better and providing better quality of the early learning experiences that they have in their life. So this is Department of Early Learning mission to focus on children, and I do understand that we have differences in agenda. So it's why I would like to hear more about something, and I believe the more we will define things, the better it will be and easier it will be to resolve our differences. The next comment is the legislature and field thinks this process is about alignment and streamlining, so the next step better streamline something. Again, it will be great to define something, and we do believe that we've been so far following the legislation ask to align the standards and streamline them. So again, if we can talk more precisely, it will be much easier to resolve the differences in our perspectives. Are we still operating on the same proposed timeline for the WACs that they'll be officially proposed in October, November? It's a great question. So far, it's what we know. If there will be differences in what we or changes in what we originally been thinking about, it will be great. I also would like to let you know that all comments, final comments, came from the same person. So again, thank you so much for participating. Please contact me directly or Holly and Dan 5x5 in regard of the feedback report. And Rachel, Kelly, Nicole with all your comments and suggestions about ECAP and Early Achievers reviews and new developments in their standards. And have a great Friday and a good restful weekend. The weather is supposed to be very friendly and warm, not hot. Thank you so much again. Bye.